talk a little bit about kind of what I do now and my role with the Red Sox. Can everybody hear me pretty good?
Yeah.
So I was back in 1996. I was right here on campus as a student and everything, and decided I wanted to get into scouting. In high school I played baseball and basketball and cross country. I actually ran cross country here, but didn't play baseball here. Ran cross country here, and started going out to high school and college games in the area. And there's a handful of scouting books that are a little bit older books, but I got hold of those books and started reading up on scouting. And at high school and college games, would run into scouts and pretty much just ask some questions and try to figure out how does this whole process work. And so in the summer of 1996 started going out to NECBL games, which is the New England Collegiate Baseball League, Summer Collegiate Wood and Bat League. And so at that time, living in Connecticut, a lot of the teams were in Connecticut, in Waterbury and Danbury and Middletown and Eastern Connecticut. I think Manchester, Connecticut had a team. There was teams in Worcester and Rhode Island at the time, and now it's a little bit more expanded. So like every night I started going to games, and I created a scouting template basically on my word processor. So it was a little while ago, and then what would happen is while I was doing that, I was able to reach out to some scouts who were running open tryout camps. All right, so at this time I wasn't scouting for anybody. I was just going to games, and eventually, like a lot of the scouts in the area knew me as Dave Scrivines, the guy that scouts the NECBL every night. So by the end of the summer, I was able to put together a packet of maybe 75 to 100 reports on players that were in the NECBL in that summer. Sent those packets out to all the clubs. And then in, I guess like later on that fall, had a couple of interviews. In fact, Art Ponarelli, who's now part-time with the Mets based out of Rhode Island, was a full-time scout with the Colorado Rockies. He interviewed me like right in this building, somewhere in this building at the time, and got hired as an associate scout. Associate scouts or bird dogs, work for a full-time scout but do it unpaid. There's no money involved. But living in Connecticut, I would go out and see high school and college games and help out with tryout camps and basically learn how to scout. Try to get to know the players in my area, which was like one state, and help out somebody that had 6 or 7 or 8 states. And every year in scouting on the amateur side, the areas get bigger and bigger and bigger. So at the time, New England was an area, and then New York got added, New Jersey got added. So scouts needed more and more help, scouting those areas. So at any rate, I did that for 8 years with Colorado. This was a time when Craig Breslow was in high school and college, and Matt Harvey and Charlie Morton and all these guys were in high school and college in Connecticut. And then from there ended up taking on an associate scout role with the Major League Scouting Bureau, which no longer exists, but for 35 years, the Major League Scouting Bureau supported all the clubs and their scouting efforts. So in other words, the reports that we would write would go to all the clubs, and it was basically like a support role for all the major league clubs. So fast forward to 2008, and I'd done this for 11 years at that point, and I was teaching as well and coaching, and I decided, hey, you know what, it's getting tough to keep doing this unpaid. And so I said, I think I'm going to stop doing this for a little while. And I was teaching high school full-time at the time, and I remember sitting in my office in, late spring, and I said, let me send some emails out to the Red Sox. I'm a Red Sox fan, lifelong Red Sox fan. So started sending out emails to the Red Sox, not knowing where this was going to go. And then at any rate, Ray Fagnant, who's a longtime area scout for the Red Sox in the Northeast, got a couple of phone calls from our club, asking like, hey, do you know this guy in Connecticut? He's done some associate scout work. So I got a great recommendation from Ray, and then the Red Sox said, hey, look, we're creating a position to scout the independent leagues. We had just had success with Daniel Nava getting to the big leagues that year. And basically the Red Sox wanted to hire a part-time person to scout the independent leagues. I never scouted the independent leagues. There was a team in Bridgeport about 10 minutes from my house, and they said, hey, this is great. You can go there and see all the Atlantic League teams. But I'll back up a second. So true story here. So as I'm driving to Fenway Park. I'm gonna meet with Jared Porter, and interview with him, and my car breaks down. So I'm on the Mass Pike, exit 10, or what used to be exit 10 in Worcester. My car breaks down, and I gotta call and say my car broke down. I can't make my interview. So now I'm like, oh geez, am I gonna get a rescheduled interview? How's this all gonna work out? But at any rate, at the end, this was in the summer. By the end of the fall season, got put on as a part-time guy, and basically, was told you're covering the Can-Am League, the Atlantic League, go get 'em sort of situation. So it was 99% of what I was doing was I had to initiate it. I had to be a self-starter. I had to organize my schedule and that sort of thing. So just started going out to games. At that time, the Can-Am League had teams in Massachusetts, in Pittsfield, Worcester, Brockton, Nashua, New Hampshire, Newark, a lot of those type of markets. And the Atlantic League had teams in, Bridgeport, Long Island, Somerset. So I was really commuting to all those places. And then over time, I started adding other leagues, started adding the Frontier League, the American Association, the Pioneer League, the United Shores League. And so with the independent leagues, the independent leagues are, minor league, but unaffiliated with major league clubs. So if we have interest in a player, we purchase their contract through the independent league team and then assign that player, to one of our affiliates. So typically how this will work is the Red Sox will say, hey, we need a AA starting pitcher, let's say. And then I've got to go out, find those guys, find some candidates, that could fill that role. But not only from a performance standpoint, but also, players that are good clubhouse guys. So I've got to get all the background information and I'll make sure that these players are fit. So I have 52 independent league teams that I'm responsible for. God bless. And, earlier in this season, the Atlantic League starts out, mid-April. They get started. I go out, start seeing Atlantic League games. A couple weeks later, the American Association will begin. And so I'm just trying to go out and start seeing players and games and try to come up with as big of a database as I can on players that some of them have been undrafted free agents. Some of them have been in the big leagues, have been released. Some have been minor league free agents, and that sort of thing. So, we're scouting it, and then we don't know when we're going to have needs. And then the other thing is sometimes we might feel like, hey, a player has some ability, but for whatever reason, maybe they got injured at some point and their performance dropped, and next thing you know, they've been released and they're in the independent leagues. A lot of it is performance based, obviously, but we're looking for guys that can fill roles in our organization. and provide value or have upside to help our big league team or provide depth in our minor league system. So that's a big part of what I do. And if you go on Baseball Reference, which all of you have, you can get a good idea of what a player's history is. Maybe it's a year or two. Maybe that player is 24 years old and is in the Pioneer League, or maybe it's a former big leaguer who's got 8 years of big league experience and that sort of thing. But the big question then becomes, all right, what's that player going to be in the future? What changes has that player made? Because a lot of times, like, what we see is what Baseball Reference says that player is. But in Rich Hill's case in 2015, Rich Hill was out of baseball in 2015, early in 2015, signed with the Atlantic League with Long Island, and I just happened to be literally like at the last minute went to the game when I got a call from our office. My wife was actually playing in a tennis tournament in Western Mass on a Sunday morning. I was at the tournament watching her, was taking a day off from seeing games, and was asked, hey, can you get to Long Island for 2 o'clock game? So I was able to get there, saw Rich Hill, and he was lights out at this point. He had done some things. He had changed his arm slot. He had moved over on the mound. He was his curveball usage rate wasn't like what it is now, but at any rate, the Red Sox were there, the Brewers were there, and so he was like so lights out. And of course, like, we know that in the independent leagues, you pay $3,000 at the time, and you own that player's rights for $3,000. It's a lot more now. So I had to use a little bit of traditional scouting, because I don't know if Milwaukee Scout is on the phone with their office trying to say, hey, we're signing this guy after the game, or that sort of thing. So I actually left that game after the third inning, just to kind of throw off the other club, because we don't know, I'm like, this guy can pitch in the big leagues right now, and there's still a little bit of risk, but at any rate, like in Rich Hill's situation, we signed him, he got to AAA, the curveball usage rate really spiked. We felt like that's what would lead him to perform well and get guys out. And by September, he had 4 starts in the big leagues, and I think 2 or 3 were shutouts, but they're like really good performances. And then ultimately ended up signing with Oakland, I believe, that off season. But a lot of the independent league coverage involves having a rapport with the managers in those independent leagues, because we can do the baseball side of the evaluation, but the tough part is, if I get a call from our office, I've got to be able to get information quickly on players. And what'll happen in the independent leagues, minor league affiliated baseball, the focus is development. Such and such a pitcher is going to throw his a certain amount of innings, certain amount of pitches. So and so is going to get his at bats. Independent league baseball, the focus is on winning. So the managers are not concerned with developing players. Their directive from ownership is to win games. So affiliated minor league ball and the independents are totally different from that standpoint. So we might call a manager and ask about the makeup and get a bad report on the makeup from that manager, and that player might not have bad makeup, but that manager wants to keep that player. So that manager is like trying to throw us off, so we don't sign that player. On the flip side, the makeup might not be good, but the manager tells you, like, hey, it's really good because that manager wants that player to get signed. So this is where, like, big part of my job is trying to develop a rapport with all the managers to get the best possible information on each of those players to make those decisions, because it's not just the evaluation part that's important. Like, that's a big part of it, but part of it's, will this player fit into the clubhouse? Are they going to work hard? Like, what type of influence are they going to be? And usually it's not a situation where the club will say, hey, give us, the best player. It's usually, hey, who are the top three or four candidates to fill whatever the role that we're looking for. So let's say the club's looking for a high A shortstop, for example. I might be able to say, hey, I have three players that could fill that role. One might be more of a bat over glove type, where if we're looking for more of an offensive player, we could go with player A. Player B might be a defensive player that's not going to provide a lot of offense, but will be a really steady glove. And then maybe player C might be like a higher risk, higher reward type player. And then so like ultimately the club's making the decision as far as like, hey, what do we want? We want the offensive player, the defensive player, the higher risk, higher reward guy, or the guy that's maybe, a steady defender and going to make the plays. Because in the affiliated levels of minor league baseball, a lot of times, we're trying to, protect maybe one of our better starting pitchers, for example. We might want somebody that could just be solid defensively and make plays. This year, like Brett Kennedy, for example, started out at Long Island in the Atlantic League. We had a need in Double-A and ended up going with him. But one of the things that's interesting in the independent leagues is they only have about a 1 week preseason, 1 week spring training. It's not a full month. It's so to me, like in the Atlantic League, early season independent leagues, those first couple of weeks are almost like spring training. Some of those pitchers have maybe only pitched one preseason game before the season started. So, Brett Kennedy, I saw him opening night and he threw well, but in my mind, I have to project a little bit because I know it's week 1 of the season. That's essentially like a spring training start for him. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and we have to do a little bit of digging to see is he in mid-season form? Has he been throwing a lot, or is the club gonna bring him along slowly? What's his is there a pitch limit? All that sort of thing. So, try to think what else I can tell you. The independent leagues. In 2019, the purchase cost, of the independent league players was about $3,000 to $5,000. This has gone up to $15,000 in the last year or so. So in 2021, for example, there was, I'm going to say 120 to 130 players signed out of the independent leagues by affiliated clubs. So this was a very high number. It was a record-breaking number in 2021. Some of the independent leagues actually mid-season raised the purchase price because so many guys were being purchased from independent league teams. This last year, that purchase price spiked up to $15,000. So it started to trend the other way, where less and less guys were getting picked up. So now with Major League Baseball and the independent leagues being, partner leagues and trying to work together, they're trying to work together on, figuring out the purchase price structure and that sort of thing. So I don't make a schedule ahead of time. So unlike a traditional pro scout who in January and February can say, all right, I'm working on my schedule for the year, I can't do that because I don't know, who's going to be with which independent league team. A lot of players will get released by affiliated camp in March or at the end of March and then end up with an independent league team. So I have to wait to see how all those rosters shake out. And so my schedule is usually week to week. That first week of the Atlantic League, I'll go out and just start seeing games. It's a little bit easier because when the Atlantic League's going, there's no other leagues going. There's only 10 teams. There's only 5 possible games those first couple weeks. So, but as the season goes on, then I have to start to prioritize. Know what our needs are, talk to managers, talk to other sources, try to gather the best information that I can to start building my schedule. I learned about 10 years ago, if you start doing your schedule ahead of time, and I did this for a couple of years, by the time you get to July and August, I'm sitting at ballparks, for example, where I don't necessarily need to be. So maybe a team in the Frontier League had a couple of pretty good players, but they got picked up, so I don't necessarily need to be there. But the travel for me is of 52 teams that I've got to cover, about a dozen of them are commutes, and then the rest of them I'm hopping on planes. I try to utilize hubs where I can fly to and drive to a bunch of games. So, for example, the Chicago area, I can fly into Chicago and then drive within 2 hours to 9 or 10 different teams. So I try to look for places that I can drive somewhere, and then like if I get a call one night, hey, can you switch gears tomorrow and change gears? And we did have this a couple times this year where the club said, hey, can you switch over to affiliated coverage? I was able to do that, but a lot of times it's in the evening, I'm at a game, and hey, can you go somewhere else tomorrow? So a lot of times it's short notice, and then I've got to be able to like hop on a flight and go away from whatever I'm currently doing and switch gears. So it's challenging, but like the independent leagues are different, so that's a big part of the challenge is being able to switch gears, being able to gather information quickly. Sometimes all of a sudden we'll see something on Twitter, we'll see something that, hey, a pitcher's velo is spiking, a hitter's like crushing it, a hitter's on a home run tear where there's a player last year who had 5 or 6 home runs, I think, in a 2-game span. So all of a sudden, like, that gets people's attention, and then our priorities, our pref lists are constantly changing where, something that maybe wasn't a priority is a priority, or vice versa. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So I'm very curious, how many games a week are you averaging seeing?
Yeah, so I would say in a typical month, I probably have like anywhere from 3 to 5 days off during the month. So I'm going pretty regularly. Mondays are usually off days for the most part in the independent league. So it's like Tuesday through Sunday for the most part. Sometimes logistically it might get challenging where I might say, all right, I want to see that starting pitcher, and that starting pitcher. And so we're trying to like line up starts. Or sometimes we might have to see a reliever. And so this is the tricky part if you're trying to see a reliever, because you either have to go in and sit at a ballpark for 1, 2, 3 nights until the reliever pitches, or you have to talk to the manager and say, I'm coming in tomorrow night, can you pitch that pitcher? And in many cases, the managers will, but you can get burned if you ask a manager and then they pick up the phone, call another major league club and say, the Red Sox are coming in, tomorrow. And then, we did this, for example, with Tyler Matzik, who was in the World Series not that long ago, and he was in the independent leagues with Texas Air Hogs and the American Association. He's someone that had some control trouble and that sort of thing. I talked to the manager of the team at the time and said, hey, I'm coming it was Gary, Indiana, to see him. And then I get there 3 days later, and I arrive at 4 o'clock for a 7 o'clock game, and he got signed an hour before that. So the downside is, like, if you don't totally trust your source or you don't want to take the chance, then you've got to go in, and you might have to sit there for 3 games, and then you lose a couple of days. But it's a tough call. It's like a gut feel call as far as like do I talk to the manager or not?
A lot of games, a lot of years, a lot of travel. What's your level of love for the game now compared to when you started, and are there times that you missed that teaching job?
Yeah, so I'm actually fortunate now where, like, with the Red Sox, I'm full-time seasonal basically. So I teach part-time college as an adjunct sport management classes. So I'm still, able to stay in teaching. But, the years that I was doing all the amateur coverage, I always wanted to be an area scout on the amateur side. And I never had any interest in going on to the pro side. But then once I got onto the pro side, doing the independent leagues, I'm like, I don't want to be an area scout anymore. So, it's definitely like a lot of travel and that sort of thing. And for the most part on the pro side, you're, sitting somewhere for 3 to 4 days, covering a series, or trying to, see all the team's starting pitchers, for example, especially, the Atlantic League and the American Association are the two top indie leagues pretty much. As far as like veteran pitchers and that sort of thing. So, I like to sit somewhere for a couple of days versus like, there was a point when we had a couple needs where it was like, fly here, see a pitcher, fly somewhere the next day, and like do that for a couple weeks. But for the most part, it's not that chaotic as far as like the travel. So, yeah.
Two-part question. Who do you report to in the Red Sox organization? And secondly, with the consolidation of the affiliated minor leagues, has your role been enhanced? Are you more important now than you were? Because there's so many fewer minor league teams, the independent leagues that are kind of filling the gap.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we have a director of pro scouting, and then a couple of assistant directors. So, like, usually, like, those 2 or 3 guys are the folks that I'm reporting to, like, on a regular basis. And kind of like you've alluded to, minor league baseball, an entire level of minor league baseball was eliminated. So it reduced the amount of affiliated teams. The draft was reduced as far as how many rounds the draft was. And then, for example, in the Pioneer League, those 10 Pioneer League teams that used to be affiliated, now they're independent league. Some of the other teams like Tri-City, for example, which used to be a New York Penn League, now they're independent league. So in that year, in 2020, my coverage went from 36 teams up to 52 in a span of 2 years because those affiliated teams became independent. But a lot of teams that were, cut out by Major League Baseball went to the summer collegiate wood and bat leagues. And a lot of that is cost structure just because, as an affiliated minor league team, the big league team is paying the player salaries, the coach salaries, all that sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden you go independent and that team now has to pay the players. They have to pay the workman's comp and all that type of stuff. So the cost structure made it difficult for a lot of those teams to like keep their pro ball team versus either stop operating or, become a summer wood and bat type league where the players aren't getting paid. They just have to pay the coaching staff. So I think the big part is now where more guys are going undrafted, more players have to go the independent league route, to get to affiliated ball. So, like in theory, my job's more important. But with the purchase fee going up to $15,000 this last year, less players are getting purchased out of the independent league. So, I don't know. I don't know like what's going to happen like moving forward. And those fees like drop actually during the out of season. But some of this is still like changing, where it's hard to get answers on, hey, after the season, what's the purchase cost and when does it go up? I know some of the leagues now it's $2,500 out of season to purchase the player to bring to spring training. But if that player makes the team out of spring training, you've got to pay the other $12,500. So like if you keep the player, it's the same fee. But if you bring the player to camp and then don't keep the player out of camp, you're just paying that $2,500. Yeah.
Do most Major League Baseball teams have independent scouts? And I assume you run into them all around. So, are you friendly with them? Is it a rivalry? I mean, how does that? Do they all kind of try to give you false information that you can trust?
Just the Yankees. Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say about half the teams have independent league scouts, somebody that is specifically, in charge of scouting the independent leagues. Some scouts will have somebody who maybe like is full-time and maybe half the responsibility is the independent leagues, half is maybe big league coverage or affiliated minor league coverage. So I'll see those guys out on the road some, but not as much as you would think just because there's 52 teams. And like there's probably like 8 to 10 of us that like talk a fair amount, but and we'll share like some information, but it depends like what the information is, or like if it's like a Rich Hill situation, like I'm not sharing anything. But we try to like help each other out a little bit. Yep.
What do you when you watch a game? What does your report look like? Or do you make a report at no matter whatever game you went to?
Yeah. So the nice thing with the independent leagues, and I do have some affiliated coverage each year too. So like I cover Hartford for a week, sit on those guys for like 6 or 7 games. I had some other coverage in Florida with some minor league affiliated coverage, but with the independent leagues, it's right up the guys that you like. So that's kind of like up to me. And then, we have a computer database where we've got to, write a traditional report on the player and, assess their current skills and current tools. And then, what does the future look like? What role could that player play in our organization? We've got to talk about the makeup. We've got to talk about a lot of independent league players are playing out of position. That's another thing. So maybe a player is playing a position because they've got a better player at the position that player should be playing at. So in our report we might say, hey, so and so, I saw him at this position, but we feel he should be playing this other position. Sometimes a player might have really good arm strength that we think could be a conversion player. Maybe we could put somebody on the mound who's a position guy. So, the reports always, usually include like a recommendation, like, what would be the context for us to acquire this player? Like, should we flat out sign this guy? Would he be somebody that could fill like what role in our organization? So we've got to like try to paint as clear of a picture as possible in those reports, and then be like pretty definitive on like what we think as well. Yep.
I'm just going to ask, when you go on the road to these ballparks, do you usually behind home plate or the seats kind of determine with the Red Sox, like have that all set for you from ballpark to ballpark with the staff? Do you have a part for it?
Yeah, so usually with the indie clubs, like I'll reach out in advance and just say, hey, I'm going to be in town on this date or these games, and then a lot of times the scout seating is behind the plate, which usually works out pretty good. And then we go in there, and I usually like to, if I'm going for a series, I like to get to batting practice at least like once during the series. Ideally like early in the series, just to like get a feel for like some of the players and tools and that sort of thing. But a lot of times the teams won't take batting practice on the field, or maybe it's the first day of a series and a team's coming in where they just had a 12-hour bus ride and they're not taking BP the first day. So sometimes I'll try to time it where I can see both both teams take BP rather than like one team one day and then go back the next day for the other team. But a big part of it too is like talking to the managers, and it's other sources too that, I'll connect with, whether it's a play-by-play person, somebody in public relations, a clubhouse guy, all sorts of people that over time, like doing this now for 14 years with the Red Sox, I know people with different teams, and it might be in addition to the manager. It might be somebody that I know is at a lot of games there. It might be a sports writer. It might be a blogger, that sort of stuff. So sometimes we can get some really good information or stuff that might help us like put the puzzle together a little bit better. And that's really what it is. It's like trying to piece things together. And a lot of times, like things in the independent leagues don't make sense on paper. And so there's a lot there. Like our job is to like figure out what the backstory is. If a player got traded, a lot of times trades don't make sense on paper in the independent leagues. A team just traded their top 3 starting pitchers for a player to be named later, and it's like, well, wait, like that trade wouldn't make sense. But maybe a team is trying. So there are some owners in the independent leagues that own teams in different leagues, so they're trying to help out one of their other teams. Or managers have situations where they're trying to help out, a friend of theirs with a team in another league, and they're going to get something in return later on. So there's all sorts of backstories with trades and players and that sort of thing.
Can you tell us, like, when you're, what, from a scout standpoint, like, what you're looking at? Say it's either a pitcher or a position player. Like, from the scout's mind, what are you watching that, like an average fan, you're just watching the game, what do you see? What are you looking for that average folks don't know look for?
Sure. Like for example, with pitchers, we're looking for arm strength. We're looking at the pitchers, like pitch mix, like what pitches are they throwing? How do the hitters react to those pitches? Is it a swing and miss pitch? Is it a complementary pitch? Is it a pitch that maybe shouldn't be part of the pitch mix? And then does the pitcher have control and command of those pitches? Are they throwing strikes? Can the pitcher make adjustments? Is there deception in the pitcher's delivery? Is their arm action easy? Can we project on that pitcher? Do we think maybe it's a starter that maybe doesn't throw enough strikes, that could be a bullpen arm and more effective? And just there's plenty of guys in the independent leagues, pitchers who maybe don't throw enough strikes, but they're starting pitchers because their team is short on starting arms. So, but a lot of it is like, how are the hitters responding? Are they having trouble locating the ball? Maybe is the pitcher's timing or their arm slot throwing off the hitters, that sort of thing. On hitters, we're looking for, the hitting ability. Are hitters making adjustments? Is there a lot of hard contact? What's the power like? Is there pitch recognition? Is the plate discipline there? And then like defensively, speed, footwork, arm strength, agility, range. What types of routes are outfielders, taking to the ball? What type of jumps off the bat? Because sometimes you get a player that might have like really good speed, but might get bad jumps or take bad routes, and so the speed might not necessarily play up. Whereas you get somebody that maybe has average speed at best, but maybe gets a really good read off the bat, takes good routes, that sort of thing. So we have to like figure that out quite a bit. Catchers, same thing. It's like arm strength, receiving, pitch calling's like really important. Controlling the running game, because in the independent leagues, the running game's more important, and more teams we see in the independent leagues trying to run more. more than in the affiliated game. So the catching becomes really important at the independent league level. Ultimately, we're trying to figure out like what would be that player's role though for the Boston Red Sox. So, and then part of it involves going to batting practice. On a relief pitcher, trying to see like back-to-back outings, or again, like maybe a pitcher's like a starter and is better suited as a reliever, or like whatever the case may be. There's some guys with easy arm action that could be relievers, and you can project some uptick in their velocity based off their easy arm action, which also like could impact like rate of injury, or that sort of likelihood that a pitcher who's like max effort is more apt to like get hurt than somebody with an easy arm action and easy delivery, and like whether it's like a head whacker or that sort of thing. So
This popped in my mind. Do you
Yep.
have players that realize your role, that you're a scout, and maybe like before a game, after a game, they're trying to like help sell themselves? Do you try to plug themselves to maybe get a better report or recommendation from you?
I don't think so. A lot of times, like when we get to the ballparks early, a lot of times like I'm like down the line partway, maybe like behind the first base dugout, sitting a ways up, or so a lot of times like we're not spotted. Now a lot of the indie league managers are pretty good about picking out like who we are, sort of thing. And sometimes a lot of times we go into the clubhouse before the game, so a lot of the players might be aware, hey, there's a scout in town, or that sort of thing. And then sometimes we're depending on a lot of these towns that we go into are smaller towns and that sort of thing. So like we might be eating at the same restaurant, staying at the same hotel, that sort of thing. So and a lot of sometimes it's a player that I know, maybe a player that I was familiar with on the amateur level, or maybe somebody that attended one of my workouts, sort of thing. So sometimes sometimes that happens, but we want to try to get like the best possible look where we know. Sometimes a pitcher might be pressing, if they see a radar gun's behind the plate, and all of a sudden a guy's overthrowing. And I've had managers say that, like, hey, just saw like his worst game because he knew somebody was there, and now all of a sudden that pitcher's like pressing a little bit, or that happens a fair amount. Whereas like if we can sometimes blend in, or sometimes just walk into the ballpark without a radar gun, without a stopwatch, just walk in, sit there. And now a lot of the ballparks have radar guns in place where we don't need that radar gun. All the minor league affiliated ballparks have it. So it's something that helps us a little bit if we don't need to like use that radar gun. And then over time, Chicago Dogs, for example, in the American Association, the radar gun's 4 to 6, ticks high. So I've got to pull out the radar gun because I don't know, it says 99, but this pitcher was 90 the week before in Milwaukee or something like that. So there's a little bit of like detective work and trying like sometimes to not be noticed. But sometimes if it's an empty ballpark, some ballparks we go into, like when St. Paul, for example, was in the independent leagues, they're drawing 9,000 people a night. You're just one of 9,000 people. Whereas you go into somewhere else and there's an entire section behind the home plate, and you're the only person in that section. Like everybody knows why you're there. So, yep.
David, I know that one of the things that Soft Limits is asking you to talk about transactions, player transactions that might happen in the future. But I wondered, do you have an opinion on the Christian Vasquez trade? Did the Sox get decent value for a guy you might say is the 5th or 6th best catcher in Major League Baseball right now?
You know what? It's like with what I do, like I'm so locked in on like the independent leagues, there's things happening with like on the big league team that like I don't even know about, sort of thing. And I was just saying to somebody, like, I didn't even get to Fenway this year. Like, I saw 0 Red Sox games in person, so I don't even feel I'm qualified to answer that. But like how teams figure out like what value a player has, and it's tricky, and it changes too sometimes, where we're trying to like assign probability on like a starter versus a reliever versus like something else. So and a lot of teams now are looking for like versatility, for example. So it's hard like figuring out like how do you weigh everything, and so a big part of what we try to do is like take our best shot as far as like taking a guess on something, but knowing we're sometimes we're going to be wrong, or there's some risk to like, but we have to do that too. Like, we can't say like, hey, I'll tell you a quick story. So a year ago, there was a pitcher that popped up on Twitter or what have you, and he was in the independent leagues in the American Association, and we were hearing that the velocity was 99 to 101, and the pitcher hadn't pitched in about 3 or 4 years. So the day or two later, I flew out to Chicago and like drove to the game that I talked to the manager, Butch Hobson, about getting this pitcher into the game. So I'm there now. I see the pitcher throw, I think 9 pitches. It was a reliever. So I see 9 pitches. 8 strikes, 1 ball, it's strikes, strikes, strikes. But you go on Baseball Reference, a 4-year like window on Baseball Reference, it's 8 walks per 9, 10 walks per 9. So then you're like, all right, well, his history is, you can see what his history is. The pitcher doesn't throw strikes. But I see a 1-inning sample, and he threw strikes. So, like, I know the question's going to come up from our club, like, do you think he's going to keep throwing? Like, what you saw contradicts what Baseball Reference says. So, do you think he's going to trend in that direction or not? And that's where, like, I can't just say, like, I don't know. The reality is, like, I don't know. But you have to, like, say, well, here's what I believe, and then here's why, knowing that I might be wrong, I might be right. So.
And then how do you do that on 9 pitches?
Right. So we do more and more videos, so that's one thing that we're doing. And in the independent leagues, a lot of the leagues are getting a lot better. The American Association's really good now with video, where you can watch, like I subscribe to the American Association. I can watch any of those teams. I can get video on demand. We had a pitcher in the American Association this year that, the name started to pop up a lot. So I was able to, in 40 minutes, watch their last, 8 appearances, a relief pitcher. So we can do that a lot, too, where you almost have to supplement it with video if you're just seeing us, like a 1-inning type situation, because otherwise there's just way too much risk. But we as scouts, doing the independent leagues, a lot of it's second chances and that sort of thing. We want that player to perform. When I go into the ballparks, I want that player to do really well. I want to sign that player. I want to see that player get picked up by somebody else, maybe. Maybe it's somebody that we had, and I say, I hope that player gets another opportunity. So, I have the approach that I want that player to do really well when we get to the game. But if he does well, there's going to be other competition for that player. A lot of the independent league managers are consultants for major league clubs. So this is where it gets tricky, where they could throw you off with some of the information that they're providing you. And the other thing is, some of the indie league managers have in their contracts where they're getting a certain amount of money when a player gets picked up. So some of the managers are pushing guys just to, not all, but some of them do say, hey, I want that whatever that kicker is in my contract to get that guy picked up.
What happened to the 9-pitch guy last year?
So actually, he ended up getting signed by the Diamondbacks during the off season, and then at some point this year got released. But the control was like what it had been historically, so it was better than it was historically, but like not significantly better. So that was that. But there's some interesting stories with players, and that's what makes the indie leagues pretty unique and fun to scout. Is there's some carryover from year to year, and one of the things is some of the independent leagues have age restrictions. For example, the United Shores League, you can only be in that league for 2 years, and then you've got to move on to another league. The Frontier League, you can have, I think, 3 veterans on a team, but then you have an age limit of maybe 28, and then so the players have to move on to other leagues. So there's a little bit of that where you say, all right, I saw this player in this league, and now I'm seeing him in a league against more veterans, and now all of a sudden you can see that pitcher against veteran hitters, or maybe that pitcher looked good against single A type hitters. The other thing is a lot of the Atlantic League season runs about 3 weeks later than the other leagues, so you see a lot of leagues make trades with Atlantic League teams because an American Association season gets over, let's say September 1st, and that player can get 3 more weeks in the Atlantic League, so you might see a trade. But from a scouting standpoint, all of a sudden, that Frontier League player that maybe we saw that pitcher face younger hitters, now we could see him in the Atlantic League against those veteran hitters, and that could be a separator for us, where, hey, he had success against younger hitters, but now all of a sudden he's, performing really well against veteran hitters, and that really stands out too.
Any last questions for Dave? Show me your World Championship record.
So this is 2018.
You have one for 2013 as well?
Yes.
Nice. You could hurt somebody with that.
That's probably worth more than they paying you.
So what?
That's worth more than they're paying you.
Probably.
Do you have a 2004?
No,
Okay.
no. So 13 and 18. So
So,
thanks everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we have, Carl's got parting gifts for you.
We spare no expense. David,
Oh, thank you.
being a Boston guy, you're
Yeah,
I
okay
love
with
it.
this, right?
That's awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you.
You know. You have much interaction with Hein Bloom, or is it like?
Not a lot.
Okay.
A couple of times that. That's good, right?
Yeah, it does.
Great job.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you
thanks
for
having
coming
me.
so much. What are you teaching at school?
Sport management
Wow.
at Post University in Waterbury.
Okay, because that's what Jim Master Alexis teaches
Yes.
at Western Illinois. England.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
that's cool. You're the perfect person to teach it.
Yeah, it's
so
fun.
they fit around your schedule.
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
You're a
Real
post.
awesome.
Yeah, in Waterbury.
Oh, yeah. I live in Beacon Falls. And
Yeah.
I grew up in Doggentuck, so
Yeah.
around the corner.
Yeah, I enjoy it.
Good.
Got any 30 class in the
Thank
morning?
you, well, thank you very much for coming. We'll see you last
Yeah,
Wednesday.
good to see you. No, that's all right. Your presentation was great. I enjoyed it. So, actually, the marketing part is kind of neat because I'm teaching that too.
Good?
So, yeah.
You need to like research the documents. Wow. Dig it up
Yeah.
every day.
Part of what I did was when I was in 1945, artist rendering, very simplistic. But when you look at
Wow.
what the advertisement was like,
Yeah.
but the faces of these guys were
Wow, you came all the way
white
from.
guys
the Frosty Burger Ball.
No diversity, no diversity of gender,
I tell you what the weird thing about it.
women buy jerseys too, because they wear them. They buy jerseys because they want to go to their boyfriend. They spend money too. But for some reason, mobilizing neighbors, it was just this sure that white man. It's funny, right? So that's something we dealt with as a spin-off.
That's good stuff.
Do you have a business card?
We'll see you.
If I find that, I can send it to you.
Yeah.
Well, that's a ways off. Good luck with your Yankees.
I've got that on PC someplace, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Yeah. That'd be
Big
great.
boy has since 61.
I just checked the thing, now they're up. They're at 1-0. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sure we helped them.
Prominently.
Stuff, you must have a lot of frequent flyer miles.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's a good kid, and I think it's nice with all your.
Yeah.
Giants probably.
Oh, yeah, oh, because,
Well, he's from like 90 minutes.
Take care, okay?
okay, I'll talk to you, man.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.